Good evening and welcome to Poland Daily. I'm Nicholas Richardson and this is the news. Russian forces have begun the next phase of the war, resuming their offensive aimed at seizing the administrative regions of Donetsk and Lugansk in eastern Ukraine. Russian forces, numbering about 25,000, are trying to break through from Izumia towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, where they will aim to encircle Ukrainian troops. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine announced the start of the Russian offensive in the east of the country. The Kremlin has been gearing up for this assault for weeks. We can already claim that the Russian troops have begun the battle for Donbass, for which they have long been preparing. Numerous troops are now concentrated there. The rocket attacks on Lviv and elsewhere mean that we, the world and history, take far more from Russia than Russian rockets take from Ukraine. Every life lost is an argument for Ukrainians and other free peoples for generations to see Russia only as a threat. In the embattled Luhansk region in eastern Ukraine, the worst situation is in the villages of Kremina, Popasna and Rubizna. The Russians have damaged a high-voltage line, as a result of which almost the entire Luhansk region is without electricity. There are 215 towns and villages without electricity. The enemy continues offensive operations in the east to establish total control over the Donetsk and Luhansk regions and maintain a land corridor with the temporarily occupied Crimea. Missile attacks on civilian targets throughout Ukrainian territory are incessant. Authorities in the Luhansk region have appealed to residents to evacuate as soon as possible before this becomes impossible. In areas already occupied by Russian troops, evacuation corridors could not be agreed for the third consecutive day. It is still quiet here compared to the other cities. Many people have left, the city is empty. There are still sirens and explosions, but the city is still intact. In besieged Mariupol, the Russians are bombing the Azovstal metallurgical plant from planes, where the combined forces of the Azov Regiment, naval infantry and territorial defence units are defending themselves. According to information yesterday, a number of civilians, including women and children, are also hiding underground at the plant. In southern Ukraine, the town of Nikolaev is still under shelling. Today rockets fell on a zoo. A week ago a water supply was damaged. People are drawing water from the river. I have been standing for an hour and a half. We are waiting for drinking water. I have 20-litre bottles here for 5 people. In the occupied town of Henichesk, the Russians have put the Lenin monument back in place. Observers point out that this is not the same monument that stood there years ago. Yesterday's rocket attacks on Lviv were widely echoed. Russia claims to have destroyed ammunition stores supplied from the west with these attacks. In the vicinity of Lviv, 124 combined logistics centres were attacked with rockets. Large stocks of ammunition donated for the last 6 days by the United States and European countries were destroyed. This is not confirmed either by the Ukrainians or by the United States Department of Defense. The residents of the city believe that this is how the enemy wants to intimidate them. The purpose of the attacks is to scare people, so that they live in fear, in panic. When we are at war with such an insidious enemy, unfortunately, there are no safe places in Ukraine today, because rockets are flying from everywhere. But I think that our homeland protects us. Since the first day of the invasion of Ukraine, the losses of the armed forces of the Russian Federation have already reached 20,800 soldiers, 169 aircraft, 802 tanks, and more than 2,000 armoured vehicles. Ukraine conducted its 5th prisoner exchange with Russia. 76 people returned home, among them 16 civilians, 50 soldiers, and 10 officers. This afternoon, United States President Joe Biden spoke to leaders of Western countries, including President Andrzej Duda, via a teleconference. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki was in Lviv, where he opened a container city which provides accommodation for internally displaced persons. President Andrzej Duda took part in a call with world leaders organised by US President Joe Biden. According to the White House, the purpose of the call was to discuss our continued support for Ukraine and efforts to hold Russia accountable as part of our close coordination. Apart from Biden and Duda, the call was attended by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, European Council President Charles Michel, French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg, Romanian President Klaus Iohannis, and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. There was a whole series of declarations of further support for Ukraine, both in humanitarian and in material terms. Russia's behaviour is not being understood. Ukrainians are fighting for their neighbours' security, Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki said as he opened a Polish-funded container town built in Lviv to provide temporary accommodation for people displaced by Russia's invasion. Morawiecki said it was up to Poland and other European countries to support Ukraine's fighting spirit, including through caring for the most vulnerable. We cannot leave our neighbours standing alone. The worst thing for those who fight is the awareness that they can be left alone. We have to support this fighting spirit also through caring for the weakest. Today we saw women and children, because the men are fighting at the front for a free Ukraine and also for our safety. Already 10 million people have had to leave their homes. 2.5 million of them are in Poland, but let us not forget that 6 million people are still somewhere inside Ukraine. He noted that the invasion had forced some 10 million people from their homes. The majority of that number have been internally displaced within Ukraine, and around 2.5 million have sought refuge in Poland. Morawiecki said that up to 10,000 wounded soldiers could be treated in Polish hospitals. Meanwhile, Ukraine is hoping for a quick start to the integration process with the European Union. President Volodymyr Zelensky has submitted a questionnaire on Ukraine's becoming a candidate for membership of the Union. Kiev hopes that this will be considered at the June summit of the European Council. We are following the path of integration with the Union in tragic times. Many people who represent European values are giving their lives for them. Continued efforts are being made by the United Nations to conclude a humanitarian truce in Ukraine. A ceasefire would allow the population to be evacuated from the war zone. Unfortunately, so far there is no indication that this will be possible.
Ceasefires they're not on the horizon right now, but they may be in a couple of weeks. They may be a little bit longer than that. And it will all depend on two things. The war, of course.
Russia, despite assurances of goodwill regarding the conclusion of a humanitarian truce, has launched the next stage of the invasion.
The operation in the east of Ukraine is aimed, as was announced from the very beginning, to fully liberate the Donetsk and Lugansk republics.
The Kremlin is trying to shrug off responsibility for the bloodshed in Ukraine. The United States and the Western countries it controls are doing everything possible to prolong our actions for as long as possible. Washington is provoking the authorities in Kiev to continue shedding the blood of Ukrainian soldiers. Washington has consistently imposed harsh sanctions on the Putin regime. The United States is focused on weakening the Russian arms industry by disrupting supply chains and putting pressure on the economy. In addition, the United States continues to supply armaments to Ukraine.
So Putin is facing a strategic defeat on the military front, on the economic front, as we've just talked about. Politically, President Putin is a pariah. His country is isolated diplomatically.
Sirens wailed across the Polish capital at noon on Tuesday to mark the 79th anniversary of the start of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It was the largest armed uprising of Jews during World War II and the first metropolitan uprising in occupied Europe. Representatives of the Polish government, the Polish president and city of Warsaw, and delegations from both houses of the Polish parliament and others lay flowers at the Warsaw Ghetto Heroes Monument. Poland's chief rabbi, Michael Szydrich, said a prayer for the dead. People participated in the traditional daffodil campaign, in which they wore yellow daffodil pins in remembrance of the uprising and took part in a march along the route of remembrance of Warsaw Ghetto heroes. The uprising broke out on the 19th of April 1943, as the final phase of the ghetto's liquidation by the Nazis was taking place. The insurgency, which lasted until the 16th of May 1943, was a symbolic act as it had no chance of success. In an uneven struggle, the poorly armed fighters of the Jewish Combat Organization, or ZOB, and the Jewish Military Union took on the might of the SS and Wehrmacht forces, the security police and their auxiliaries. The uprising, which cost the lives of about 6,000 insurgents, ended on the 8th of May 1943, when its then commander, Mordecai Anielewicz, together with a group of ZOB soldiers, committed suicide in a bunker at 18 Miła Street. Just a handful of fighters managed to escape from the burning ghetto through the sewers. Among them was the last commander of the uprising, Marek Edelman. That's the news. Thank you for watching. Stay with us for the weather, Poland Daily Business, and more programmes. But from me, it's have a good night and a better tomorrow.